So it's interesting to think that Netflix, that now has over 300 original movies, that's all just been within the last 5 years, and its first ever original film was Beasts of No Nation in 2015.
Yeah, and what a debut, man.
Yeah, and I almost wonder if its lack of any Oscar attention is because it was the first and they didn't yet know what to do with it. And there's still some hesitation in the Academy, or some members of the Academy, that don't think that Netflix movies should count. And so they get more nominations now, but they still struggle.
I don't know. That doesn't really make sense to me, because as long as they meet the criteria, they meet the criteria. So who cares if it's a Netflix movie?
I agree. Where I think it's tricky is, so the criteria is basically just, to have debuted in X number of theaters in, like, I think it's even specifically like a theater in Los Angeles and maybe New York. And there's certain rules as far as that goes. And then so Netflix is just making sure they are putting it as a theatrical release, even though they're releasing it simultaneously online. But I think maybe some of the hesitancy is it's just so new and not necessarily what was intended originally. And I think those rules are more to get a movie eligible within a year, not that you were kind of circumventing an online release, which didn't exist when these rules were written. And you also think of something like a HBO movie from 20 years ago. No one thought that it would have been eligible had they just released it in theaters, because it didn't necessarily even cross HBO's mind to try to do something like that. I still think it should count, because it does count under the rules, to your point. But if you don't want it to count, then you need to change your rules. And if you don't change the rules, then you have to accept that it counts.
Yeah, and I guess with the coronavirus pandemic, that is pushing some people to try and get the rules for the Academy actually changed. Because, I mean, movie theaters, obviously this year, at time of recording in 2020, have been closed and will be closed for the foreseeable future. And even if there's, a vaccine and, all of us, everything gets opened back up to the way it was before, I think that the pandemic and the shutdowns of basically the entire economy, I think it's going to have a ripple effect. I don't think that things like cruise lines and Disneyland and movie theaters are going to, I mean, they'll still be a thing, but I don't think they're going to be anywhere near as popular or utilized as they have been.
Right. It could take them years to rebound. And then obviously not just the theaters are the movie productions. So everything's got to get opened back up. And then it takes months to then get a film back up and going to where, so yeah, it's going to continue to be a mess. And yeah, they could maybe kind of have to change the rules to allow for some of this online stuff as well. But anyway, back to the film here today, which does give us a all too depressing look at child soldiers in the world. And this film is not based on a specific Civil War. And actually, even the book it's based on kind of goes out of its way to not be a specific conflict. It does seem to have its most parallels with the Sierra Leone Civil War, however.
Yeah, it's an unnamed kind of fictional West African country.
Right.
We know that it is in West Africa because we see at the beginning the ECOMOG troops, which is the Economic Community of West African States Monitoring Group,
which seems to be essentially like a Western Africa UN, right, for all intents and purposes.
Yeah. And so the members are Ghana, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Gambia, Liberia, Mali, Burkina Faso, which we were in recently with Bulad, and Niger. So those are the countries that make up ECOMOG. So it's set somewhere in West Africa.
Yes.
But they never mention a specific country, and they never mention like a specific leader or even really a specific year, which you can kind of, I mean, we're putting this movie in the timeline, I think, kind of based on
when the book came out. Well, not
when it came out, but when the book came out, because it could really be any time from like, I don't know, maybe
1990 like, to the present. Yeah.
Even 80s, 90s, all the way up to the movie came out in 2016. But any time during there, it could have been anywhere.
And while this is something that's typically associated with Africa, child soldiers have been used all over the world and for centuries, frankly. I mean, even like,
Yeah.
even, there was people, you hear stories about people being 15, 16, even the United States signing up for World War One and stuff like that,
Yep.
or Napoleon instead using troops, or, obviously think back in ancient times, it wouldn't have been a thing, or you think back to Braveheart with, throwing a kid on there wouldn't have been a thing. But it's only been in the 21st century where there's been these concerted efforts and groups set up to try to actively put a stop to it. It is already, it's against international law, but obviously it still happens because these people aren't afraid to break the law. And now in our story here specifically, it does serve as a great example of the lives of these kids and how they might fall into some of these crowds, even if it isn't dealing with a specific actual event.
Absolutely.
And our main kid is basically, they're just part of a village that they know the kind of war is coming through. It seems like there's kind of the official state-sponsored soldiers, and then there's the rebels, and the war is kind of just working their way toward their village, and they're just trying to hide.
This is really reminiscent of conflicts that we've seen before, like in Hotel Rwanda, in Lumumba.
Yes.
But yeah, so his village they call it the buffer zone at the beginning of the movie. Right. So it sounds like it's kind of a no man's land between the government troops and the NDF, or the Native Defense Force, which again that's a fictional group. Like there's no NDF in real life. At least if there is, it's not like this movie isn't about a specific group. But so those two groups are in conflict, and his village is kind of smack in the middle of their two front lines, and then that's kind of the impetus for the conflict in the beginning of the movies. You see his normal everyday life. It's almost like the way that the movie is at the beginning is almost just like your standard coming of age story.
Right.
Everything's peaceful. He's like messing around with his family, messing around with his brother.
They're selling junk to the Nigerian soldiers who are kind of peacekeepers in the area.
Yeah. It shows them they have their hustle where they block the road with the big tree branch and then get people to pay him money to move it. But then all of a sudden the two fronts start to kind of close in on the town at the same time. So that's when the conflict starts. So his dad is trying to get his whole family out, but there's only so many cars in the village, and he pays some guy all of the money that he has, and the guy will only agree to take his wife and his two youngest kids. And so Agu, who's the main character, who's I don't think it ever says how old he is, but he's
probably about
maybe
12,
10
to 12,
yeah, 10 to 12 years old. Him and then his older brother, who's like a teenager, and his dad are all then left behind in the town to get killed, basically.
Well, right. They try to hide at first, just kind of hoping that the soldiers or the fighting will kind of just pass through the village, but they start just kind of killing indiscriminately and looking, and then when they find them, they assume they're part of the rebels, and then of course they get screwed by the local woman.
They which it was kind of a that was a good example of like a Chekhov's gun, where they show her in the scene where they're blocking the road, and she comes out and she's just standing in the middle of the road yelling at him because she's mentally ill, some sort of mental illness, because she's just crazy, just yelling at him for no reason, basically. And then she's the one that they bring out to say, do you know any of these people? Because they're all saying they live here. And she says, I've never seen these people before in my life. They're all rebels.
Yep. And they straight up say, yep, we're going to kill you now. And then so they just start to scatter, and Agu's the only one that gets away from his group. And after, we don't know how long, I guess he's running around, hours probably, he's running around alone, and then finally runs into this rebel army that at first, again, where the movie's going, but from his point of view, at first, okay, they're the people fighting the people that killed my family, so I guess they're the good guys. And they're feeding me, and they're training me, and they're gonna help me get revenge. This seems all right.
He lost his entire family, and so he's literally on his own in the middle of the jungle.
Right.
And he comes across this other group, and they're like, "Hey, your family got killed by the government troops. We're fighting the government troops." And it's kind of like it's like his new family, basically.
Right. Which, and again, these are kind of just how a lot of this happens in real life, where it's people who are kind of orphaned. Some kind of just, basically some volunteer for it, some kind of get captured into it, and some are kind of this mix in between where they just kind of stumble across it because they're desperate and have no other choice. And so it's very realistic that something like this would play out this way. And yeah, they kind of just running through some basic initiation things. And again, at first, if you didn't know any better or about, kind of what this was about, you would kind of think, oh, okay, well, this could work. This could work. Maybe they'll help him find his mom or whatever. And it's like, nope, it's not that kind of show. And you just kind of slowly see how ruthless and evil they are. And the first moment that really just made me cringe is when they ambush this patrol that they say is part of that same government force, but the one guy in particular that they capture and make Agu kill as like his first kill is just some college student engineer who's like out to help fix the bridges in the country. And nope, the commandant tells Agu, kill him, and gives him a dull machete to do it. And you're just
and they like linger on it too. Like it's not a fast. It's him killing the guy isn't a fast process, but the Agu, it seems like it takes him forever to make that decision, which
it would. I think it's right. He's just a normal kid.
But I'm sure also in that moment for someone to be in that position, I'm sure your perception of time is probably warped. But yeah, man, that's a harrowing scene, and
I had to kind of look away. It was bad. Yeah.
It doesn't cut. It doesn't cut away. There's like nothing is hidden. It's in the daylight. It's like full screen right in front of you.
Yeah.
Because the other kid, Strika, is also there with him.
Right. He kind of joins in.
He's like he comes to help him out, I guess. But yeah, there's a lot. There's several scenes like that in this movie. Not. I mean, there are.
As far as harrowing goes,
of the violence, but also just the unblinking, where it's super uncomfortable to watch.
Oh right, when Idris Elba's character basically rapes Agu at one point, or not basically, he does, but it's just kind of, I mean, it's not explicit, it's kind of implied, but it's obviously heavily implied. And I really enjoyed the character of Strika, his buddy about his age who appears to be mute. I kind of assumed at some point that they were going to show that he had no tongue or something, but they never really did show why he was mute, did they?
No, and I don't know if it was like he was mute or if he's just. I read it more as he was just so psychologically damaged that he just didn't speak anymore.
Oh no, right. And even if he wasn't physically mute, he was mute.
Right.
Yeah.
Because he's Agu's age, but he's been there way longer than Agu. So he's probably been in that army since he was like 8 or 9 years old.
Right. And yeah, just an interesting character because he does there's almost like a rivalry at first with them, but they become kind of fast friends and grow to trust each other, even though Strika never talks.
Yeah. And like he's at when Agu is molested by the commandant, Strika is the one who like comforts him and tries his best to comfort him anyway.
Right, just gives him a shoulder to lean on.
You can assume that he's going through the exact same thing.
And that's the implication, that it's, I've done it too. You're right, that's heavily implied as well. It just kind of, it becomes this kind of cult of personality built around the Commandant character played by Idris Elba. And you kind of see how they're all just kind of loyal to him. And again, it's almost like a Peter Pan thing with the Lost Boys, and this is just all we have is each other and this little party that goes around, and we're looking for the battle, but for reasons like we don't even know what their goal is necessarily.
And Idris Elba's character, he is very charismatic.
Right, reminds you of like an Idi Amin type. Yeah.
At the beginning of the movie, he's almost likable.
Exactly.
When you first meet him, before obviously you find out all of the child rape stuff later on, but when Agu first meets him, he's almost like he's a charismatic, likable father figure, basically.
Right. Yep. Who says we're going to help you get revenge and we're going to train you and take care of you, and but again, he's just kind of recruiting them into his cult is what he's doing, and and that actually ties into something that this is actually an article I found on childsoldiers.org where they interviewed just kind of an expert in this stuff. I forget what country he was from, but okay, he's a Canadian senator who has worked with the UN and just trying to help stop genocide and has written a lot about child soldiers. So they kind of asked him what he thought of this movie. And he basically said, it's solid, it's compelling, it's a good film, but he said it's also just super simplified, which, again, kind of obvious that it would be simplified. But the quote here near the end of the article talks about, he says, I think the film could have done more to show the indoctrination of the children and the psychological battles. It needs to be more nuanced than just African kids with AK-47s.
Yeah.
Which I think is valid. Although I do think there is, I think it gives some service to that indoctrination and the psychological stuff. But I think his point is like, that's the bulk of it. If you think about how much time they're spending with these groups, it's going to be predominantly the psychological stuff, and the battles and the guns is probably actually going to be secondary, which does make sense. Okay, so yeah, then in the film, so again, they kind of hope that we're going to end up seeing Agu's mom, because they're kind of making progress toward Taro, and then maybe try to get to the capital. And they do run across a woman at one point, and I was actually kind of confused by this. Did they do an actor switch because it was kind of illustrate what we were seeing through his eyes? Because I thought it was his mom at first, but
it was just someone else.
Okay,
at least I didn't think it was an actor switch. I thought it was just him mistaking because they are invading this town, and this is actually it's another one of those scenes that's really hard to watch. But I did think that it was a very effective use of a long take, because they invade this town and it's a single take. It's like several minutes long. I don't know how long exactly it is, but it's probably about 5 minutes or so of them, going through this building and like looking through all the rooms. And then they come across this woman who has 2 kids, and Agu is basically so psychologically broken that he thinks that it's his mom, and like runs over and like grabs onto her and is like hugging her. He's like telling her, I've been looking for you. I've been trying to find you for so long. And then basically realizes that it's not his mom, and then gets upset, gets angry.
Right, calls her a witch for tricking him.
Yeah, calls her a witch, says that she's trying to trick him. Strika he is beating one of the little kids, like a 2-year-old, in the other room. So he goes into the other room, and this is all one take. There's no cuts.
I didn't even notice that. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all one take, no cuts. It's like unblinking. It makes you feel, I don't know. It makes you feel like you're there, and that you can't leave and you can't look away. And because the camera isn't the entire scene. So he goes and he's like kicking the little girl in the other room. Then he comes back into the first room, and there's a voiceover in his head, and I forget what he says, but he's basically like talking to God in his head.
Oh, right.
And then goes back into the first room where the woman is being raped, and he shoots her, and then that's when it cuts. But I think that scene is like the peak of the horror, I guess.
Right.
Because then after that point, it kind of slows down on the violence and the war stuff. I mean, there is more throughout the rest of the movie, but that's like the peak is when they get to that town, because that's also the town where they tape the grenades in the guys' mouths.
Right. It's we're getting close to the point where Agu starts second guessing everything, which, well, honestly, I guess after he gets molested is probably the first time he starts second guessing things, but he's still committing atrocities after that. And so they get to where the overall general is. Idris Elba's character is actually just kind of in charge of this one battalion, but they're still answering to, the higher up guy who's kind of responsible of all of them. And I'm kind of confused exactly what his goal is here. Why was he wanting to replace Idris Elba? Basically, he's trying to put his number 2 in command and says he's promoting Idris Elba to another position, but Idris sees it as a demotion. Idris
wanted to be in charge of more troops, whereas the guy, I forget what they call him, the Supreme Commander.
Right.
The Supreme Commander puts him in like a staff position for him, working directly for the Supreme Commander. So the Supreme Commander sees that as a promotion, but Idris Elba sees it as a demotion because he's not leading troops into battle anymore.
Gotcha.
And his second in command, they call him 2IC, is given command of the battalion.
Right. And basically he then, a couple scenes later, it's basically Idris is mutinying against him, basically, kills 2IC or causes him to be killed, and leaves with his group, and basically says, well, the Supreme Commander is now our enemy, so we're on our own, but we still got our group here, and that's what matters. But then it doesn't take long before now they don't have any resources because they're not getting any other support, and there's basically a mutiny where they all just leave and surrender. And Agu seems like he might, a couple things. One, he seems like he might be the only one that stays behind with the Commandant. It seems like he might be the one to actually kill the Commandant. And then ultimately they just kind of all walk away, which I thought was probably the best way to handle it.
Right.
And then they surrender to like the Nigerian UN troops.
Yep.
And I'm pretty sure that because the way they played it, I'm almost certain that one of the guys there that they see recognizes Agu from buying that TV from him at the very beginning. Just like the way they kind of locked eyes for a second, and they don't. But I appreciate the way they didn't necessarily dwell on it. Like it was there, but we're not making it a thing because it's too chaotic, and that's how real life would work. Where it's like, was that the person?
Right.
Maybe it wasn't, and then we kind of see him dealing with some of the equivalent of a social worker or whatever. And
because he's like in a missionary run school.
Yeah.
And that too, I think, was really interesting because it shows just how psychologically broken and indoctrinated some of the other kids are, because he's there with like 3 other kids and 2 of them end up leaving. They say, hey, this missionary school isn't for us. We want to go back to the war.
Oh, right.
They run away from the school to go back and join the NDF. And Agu and his friend that he makes at the school are like, they're trying to convince them not to. Like, we have
food and shelter.
Food here, we have clothes here. Right, we have shelter. We're learning. They're teaching us stuff. Why would you? And they say, well, this we have to go back and fight the war. It's more important. And then they run away from the school
because they've been so brainwashed that's what. So so they didn't mind getting away from the Commandant, Idris Elba's character, but they still felt that the war itself was important and they needed to go back to continue it.
Yeah.
So the book I've never read, but I've been aware of it for a long time, and I probably should get around to reading it, is A Long Way Gone. So unlike Beasts of No Nation, which is kind of a fictionalized account that kind of just encapsulates actual events, A Long Way Gone is actually a memoir by Ishmael Bia, who was himself a child soldier in Sierra Leone. And so I've heard it's great. I'm probably going to I'd say I'd recommend it just based on its reputation, but I myself have not gotten around to reading it. Are you familiar with A Long Way Gone and Ishmael Bia?
No, I'm not.
I wish there was a book site review that was kind of as reliable as Rotten Tomatoes or even an IMDb, but I haven't had a lot of luck with those. I guess I could check it on Goodreads, but it seems like everything seems to be pretty high. Books seem to be in a much smaller window. They're all rated about a 3.5 to a 4.5 out of 5 on Goodreads. So it's hard to find a lot of wiggle room in ratings on stuff like that. Another note here, though, too, on that same childsoldier.org article, a woman who's a director for a group called War Child pointed out, too. So this is something that the film doesn't have. Actually, her quote even mentions that. So 40% of child soldiers are girls, and few films portray that, is her quote.
Huh. Well, because we don't see any in this movie.
We don't see a single one. Right. Well, they have the prostitutes they kind of kidnap at the end is about it.
Yeah, but now that you bring that up, it makes sense because a kid is a kid, and like Idris Elba says in the movie, just a kid? What do you mean just a kid? A kid has 2 eyes they can see with, and they got a finger that can pull the trigger.
Right. That all applies to a girl as well. Right. The fact that they had only boys is kind of inaccurate. Yeah.
Yeah. It would make sense that girls are the same way, and I guess that's true because you think of other movies like in Hotel Rwanda or in Blood Diamond or any other movie where you see child soldiers, that they are typically all boys.
Right. And 40% are girls, and then often though that they can basically play double duty because then often they become sex slaves, even if they're combatants at the same time. So they kind of become both.
Yeah. Well, just like Agu did in the movie. That also is not necessarily gender specific either.
Right.
I did want to bring up about the movie specifically.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So the director of this movie, Cary Fukunaga, who I don't know if I'd seen any of his other movies, but I did really like the first season of True Detective that he directed.
Yeah, I saw that.
Which I really, really liked. I haven't seen Sin Nombre and I have not seen Jane Eyre, which are his other two movies.
Nor have I.
But he's very talented, at least based on this movie, at composing really cool looking shots. Like
Yes.
like the shot at the beginning of the movie with the empty TV box where it's like it's a shot of kids playing soccer. And then it zooms out, and it's like it looks like they're on TV, but then it zooms out further, and it's just a broken, empty TV box that two kids are leaning against, watching the soccer game. I thought that was really cool.
Agu walking through the red clay water trench-looking thing was just kind of popped.
Yeah, I already mentioned that long shot, the long take where he's going through the building, and then the other one that I thought was the coolest looking scene in the movie was the first time that Agu is on the drug Brown, which it's in the story, it's right after he gets molested and he's like, very distraught. He's kind of out of it mentally. And one of the older boys tells him that he'll be better if he takes some Brown, which is it's a real drug. It's a mixture of cocaine or some sort of amphetamine, and they mix it with smokeless gunpowder. So basically you pull the projectile off of a bullet and mix the powder on the inside of the bullet with an amphetamine or with cocaine. And because the nitroglycerin in the gunpowder is a vasodilator. Yeah, it's a real drug, and it is popular in these, among these groups in West African conflicts. It's also, if you've ever seen the movie Lord of War with Nicolas Cage, where he's like the arms dealer.
I have not.
Okay, in that movie, there's a scene where he does Brown. Anyway, when Agu is on that drug, they're like getting ready to march into battle, and as they're marching in, he like looks to the side and sees these like tribal warriors walking alongside of him, and then all of a sudden the whole screen gets color corrected to where all the greens are red.
Right.
So like all the trees look red, and it's like this really surreal, wild looking scene because the whole thing is like through the eyes of Agu while he's on this drug, and it looks like, and I don't know if you're a very big video game guy, but it looks like something out of a Far Cry video game.
Okay, which I'm not familiar with, but okay.
But I just thought that was a really cool, because it's not super gimmicky. Like, it's not like they have a bunch of scenes like that. It's just like for this one short scene, it's like maybe 2 or 3 minutes long, where they use this cool color correction, and cool like sound design to show what it's like through Agu's perspective when he's on this drug.
Okay, just a quick clarification. So is the Brown both the thing we see him and Idris Elba freebasing and the thing they like cut and put in his wound?
Yeah, it's the thing that they cut and put in his wound, and I think it is the thing they're freebasing because it can also refer to heroin, because heroin is a kind of a light brown color as well.
Okay, yeah. So I thought it was interesting. So obviously we've seen freebasing in other movies, but the idea of basically applying a drug as a powder into a wound is just honestly just a way of taking a drug that never even occurred to me or that I had never seen before.
Right. Well, it's similar to like when you dip like tobacco.
Okay.
The drug is getting into your bloodstream through your skin.
But you're not cutting your lip before you put it in there.
No, but with the cut and rubbing it in, it's essentially just a faster, absorption. More efficient way of doing that.
Interesting. Yeah, I had just never seen that before and thought that was interesting and obviously disturbing all at the same time.
Yeah.
I was just going to briefly mention a little bit of Sierra Leone just because it kind of does tie in and is all but certainly what they were most kind of basing this off of, even if not, 100% directly. They were trying to keep it more open. So we actually were in Sierra Leone when I talked about Amistad, that those captured men were from Sierra Leone and ultimately got returned to Sierra Leone. So the Sierra Leone Civil War was 1991 to 2002. Basically, it was just initiated by, a military coup. It's a lot of the standard, almost at this point, stereotypical African conflict, coup, warlord type stuff. So yeah, it was an 11-year-long conflict that ultimately, with the help of the UN and the ECOMOG with Nigeria and everybody, they were just kind of able to finally put down the rebel. But it was complicated too, where it's like, there's the one rebel group, and then part of the army that helps overthrow that rebel group kind of then takes power itself and joins with that initial rebel group before, again, then like a decade later, you finally have the UN putting everything down. And then it's just a country that's had a lot of other issues with the Ebola epidemic about 5-6 years ago. Really hit Sierra Leone hard. And then in 2017, they had mudslides, and just kind of a country that's seen a lot of strife over the decades, unfortunately. But it does say today they're a constitutional republic with a directly elected president and legislature, so that's nice as long as everything's on the up and up. Seems pretty modern then with just kind of a cursory glance at how things are today. So I don't imagine they're particularly strong economically, but at least it does now have a stable government in place with democratically elected leaders. Yeah, mostly an agriculture-based economy. 2/3 of the population, deals with subsistence agriculture within the community. Mining is big.
We do see a gold mine in the movie. That's like the spot where they're hanging out for. I think they're there for in the movie. I think they say that they're there for a couple months right before they actually desert the commandant.
I almost think they didn't use Sierra Leone specifically in the movie and in the book it was based on, just so they weren't tied to anything. It was keeping it more broad, but it was, it seems pretty certain it was heavily inspired by Sierra Leone's conflict specifically. But again, child soldiers we already talked about are seen all over the world, even today, Southeast Asia, South America. ISIS would recruit child soldiers, and so it is still a problem all over the world, and will probably continue to be so for the foreseeable future. It's just too hard to control and police when you're dealing with criminal organizations, essentially. Okay, so next week we'll be dealing with a story that, while set in the United States, did have worldwide ramifications with the 2008 financial collapse in The Big Short.